The first surprise is not small. It is not decorative. It is not the sort of historical correction that merely adds a footnote and leaves the old picture standing. It is a correction so large that once you see it clearly, the old picture cannot be put back together again in its former shape. If you placed many Paleolithic women beside many modern men, the ancient women would not be the fragile presence in the room. Their bones, where bone still survives, carry the stamp of a life loaded with force, repetition, distance, cold, weight, impact, recovery, and endurance in ways that many modern bodies, male or female, never come close to meeting. The skeleton is not flattered by storytelling. It is shaped by use. And when the use is constant, the bone becomes a kind of memory that does not blur with the centuries. That claim sounds almost rude to the modern imagination. It disturbs a hierarchy that has been told so often that it began to pass for common sense. We inherited the cave painting version of the human past, in which men move through the frame as action and women remain at the margins as atmosphere. Men hunt, men invent, men endure, women wait, women gather. Women receive the return of history rather than make it. But when archaeologists learned to read women's bones in a female frame, rather than as lesser copies of male bones, a different human past stepped forward. It did not arrive in slogan form. It arrived in arm bones, shin bones, hip joints, burial goods, wear patterns, trauma signatures, and the quiet, stubborn testimony of skeletons that had no interest in pleasing modern prejudice. It arrived slowly, in laboratories where the equipment was patient enough to ask the right questions, in cemeteries where bodies had been waiting thousands of years for a method capable of hearing them. If you are listening at the end of a long day, perhaps with the house dim, perhaps from a chair that has become familiar to your body over the years, bring to mind for a moment the oldest woman in your family whose labour you can still almost feel. A grandmother whose hands worked dough, cloth, soil, laundry, infants, animals, or tools. An aunt whose shoulders carried more than she ever announced. A mother who moved all day and never once called it training. Keep her near as we move through this, because one of the deep currents under tonight's story is that female strength has often been most powerful when it was least praised. The bodies that built the human world rarely received applause for the building. They received expectation, and they answered it, decade after decade, until the answering became the body itself. In 2017, Alison Macintosh and her colleagues at Cambridge compared the upper arm and lower leg bones of prehistoric women from Central Europe with those of living women, including competitive rowers from Cambridge's own boat club. The result was sharp enough to travel around the world in a single headline. Early agricultural women had arm bones stronger than those of elite modern rowers. Their upper limbs had been loaded so intensely and so repeatedly that the bones still remembered it thousands of years later. The rowers, training twice a day, rowing around 120 kilometers a week in trial season, were among the most physically prepared young women on the planet at that moment. Their arms were still outmatched by the arms of women who had been dust for 7,000 years. That was already enough to overturn a familiar softness projected backward onto ancient women. But the story did not end there, because another line of research reached deeper into the body itself and deeper into time. A separate Cambridge study led by Colin Shaw examined the inner structure of hip bone in hunter-gatherers and farmers and compared them to other primates. What emerged was an unsettling scale of decline. Hunter-gatherers from around 7,000 years ago had bone strength comparable to modern orangutans. Farmers from the same region millennia later had markedly lighter, weaker bone. The shift was not toward human perfection, it was toward physical reduction. Our species did not rise into bodily superiority with civilization. In several plain mechanical ways we diminished. Shaw was blunt about what this meant. There is, he said, no anatomical reason a person born today could not achieve the bone strength of an orangutan or an early human forager. We do not, because we no longer load our bones in the way life once forced us to. And once you understand that, the title before us stops sounding like provocation and starts sounding like overdue honesty. The phrase Paleolithic women were stronger than modern men is not a sentimental compliment to ancient womanhood. It is a statement about load, adaptation, survival, and the kind of life that shapes living tissue year after year until the body itself becomes a record of necessity. Bone is not stone. It is not inert. It changes under strain, it thickens, curves, buttresses, and reorganizes in answer to repeated demand. If a woman spends years grinding grain, hauling water, scraping hides, climbing, carrying children, lifting meat, cutting wood, working skins, shaping cordage, stalking game, or walking long distances over uneven ground, her skeleton does not treat those days as forgettable. It builds to meet them. The bone widens where the pull is strongest. The internal mesh thickens where the weight presses down. The curvature shifts where the angle of force repeats. The body is its own quiet sculptor, and the chisel is the day itself. That is where this story begins. Not with myth, not with artistic reconstruction, but with a body that kept count. Yet, the title promises more than proof of exertion. It promises an encounter with a female past that is larger than the old labels allowed. Stronger Than Modern Men is not only about raw force in the simple gymnasium sense. It is about capacity. It is about a whole body endurance and work tolerance that modern life has thinned. It is about shoulders that knew repetitive stress as ordinary life, hips that were loaded by miles rather than machines, hands trained by stubborn materials, and a metabolism shaped for sustained effort. It is about the difference between a body arranged around comfort and a body arranged around survival. The gap between those two arrangements is one of the great unspoken facts of human history, and it widens every decade as the comforts multiply and the demands recede. And because this is a story about women, the old distortions run deeper. Men's bones were studied first, described first, centered first. Women's bones were often interpreted by comparison to male patterns, as though the male skeleton were the standard text and the female body merely a shortened version. That choice hid enormous amounts of labour. Male bones often show strain in a more visually dramatic way. When female bones were measured against that standard, women's workloads appeared smaller than they were. The effect was not trivial. An entire hidden history of female labour stayed buried under the method used to uncover it. It took a generation of researchers willing to ask different questions, design different comparisons, scan different samples, and read female bodies in a female frame for the scale of that hidden labour to begin to surface. What surfaced was not modest. It was a working continent of female effort that had been there all along. So part of what happened over the last generation in archaeology was not that women suddenly became important to the human past. They had always been important. What changed was that the tools of interpretation finally moved close enough to hear them. Small CT scanners, cross-sections of bone, studies of modern female athletes, the rereading of trauma, the rereading of hunting kits placed beside female bodies, the rereading of ethnographic accounts in which women plainly hunted while earlier summaries quietly looked away. Piece by piece, a structure of omission began to crack. The cracks did not arrive with thunder. They arrived as careful measurements, repeated, peer-reviewed, replicated, until the new picture became impossible to deny without pretending the data did not exist. There is another reason this story matters tonight, especially for an audience old enough to have watched several generations speak confidently about what women are and are not built to do. We are used to hearing the female body described in terms of limitation, delicacy, vulnerability, periodic incapacity, dependence. And yet the deep human record keeps turning up a different emphasis. Female bodies are not only reproductive bodies, they are endurance bodies, adaptive bodies, recovery bodies, bodies built to work through fluctuation, bodies that can support others while continuing to move, bodies that store fuel, ration effort, and keep going in conditions that would humble modern assumptions. The female body is, in many measurable senses, a long-duration body, and the human past leaned on that fact more than any modern textbook ever fully admitted. This does not mean that Paleolithic life was kind. It was not. It was cold, hungry, injured, exhausting, uncertain, and often brutally brief. But harshness does not erase female agency. Quite often it enlarges the need for it. In a small mobile band, nothing important is optional. Food must come in, children must be kept alive, skins must become warmth, fibres must become cord, tools must be maintained, water must be fetched, fire must be fed, routes must be known, weather must be read, plants must be recognized, bodies must be treated. No one floats above such demands on theory alone. The day arrives, The cold arrives, the child cries, the meat needs cutting, the skin needs scraping, the fuel runs low, and the woman who is there is the woman who acts. Theory belongs to people who can afford to delay. Think of that for a moment without romance. A small group on a cold margin of Europe or Central Asia. Wind travelling low over open country, light short in winter, meat heavy when it arrives, fuel never quite enough, skin against skin for warmth. Tools carried because they must be. Infants carried because they must be. Nothing automated, nothing delivered, nothing press button, nothing disposable. The woman in that world is not an ornamental bystander to the human experiment. She is one of the main engines by which it continues. Remove her, and the engine fails. Diminish her contribution in memory, and the history you tell about the engine becomes a lie that flatters only the people who never had to run it. That is why the bones matter so much. Bones are poor flatterers. They are indifferent to ideology. They do not care what a textbook artist in the 20th century wanted the camp to look like. They register repeated reality. An arm loaded year after year becomes one kind of arm. A hip shaped by daily distance becomes one kind of hip. The internal mesh of bone inside the femoral head, where the thigh meets the pelvis, thickens when life demands it, and thins when life does not. The title's most important word may not be stronger. It may be proved, because proof is what disarms myth, and proof is what the skeleton offers when a careful researcher learns how to ask. Before we reach the end of the next hour, 3 things need to happen if this title is to be fully earned. First, we need to understand how bone stores the memory of labour, and why the female record was hidden for so long. Second, we need to walk into the actual tasks that built these women, from hide work to carrying to hunting, to the slow technical disciplines that do not look dramatic until you imagine doing them for years. Third, we need to follow the story beyond strength into erasure, because the female past was not only lived, it was later misdescribed. That misdescription still shapes how many people think about women, men, work, old age, frailty, and even their own bodies tonight. The misdescription is not a small thing. It is one of the most durable distortions in human storytelling, and it has cost women a true picture of themselves for a very long time. So keep the oldest woman in your family somewhere near the edge of your mind, not as a symbol, as a body, a real body, a body that lifted, steadied, scrubbed, bent, stood, walked, carried and recovered. The distance between her and a Paleolithic woman is vast in time and yet smaller than modern vanity likes to believe. The line is not unbroken in custom, but it is unbroken in flesh. The flesh remembers what the textbook forgot, and the flesh, when it lasts long enough to harden into evidence, has begun to tell on us. Chapter 1. There is a reason bones change the argument so completely. Stories can flatter a culture. Paintings can repeat a bias. Even language can hide a workload by giving it a small name. But bone answers to stress with architecture. That is why the old picture of ancient women begins to fail the moment the skeleton is read with enough care. A shoulder that has worked hard is not only a shoulder that was present, it is a shoulder that was necessary. And necessity repeated across years leaves a signature no painting can erase. Bone lives. That matters more than most of us are taught. We are often given the impression that the skeleton is a rigid frame, received once and then simply carried through time until it weakens with age. The deeper truth is more active. Bone is constantly responding to the forces placed on it. Muscles pull on it. Impact jars it. Repetition urges it to strengthen where strength is most needed. Reduced activity allows some of that elaborate internal support to diminish. The body is economical. It keeps what life requires and lets go of what life does not force it to maintain. A bone that goes unused for long enough begins, in a quiet way, to disappear from the inside. A bone that is used hard begins, in a quiet way, to grow more architecture than it was born with. When Alison Macintosh and her colleagues at Cambridge set out to compare ancient and living female bones, they were doing something that had not been properly done before. That omission sounds technical, but it had cultural consequences. Many earlier studies of past activity relied on male samples, or interpreted women by measuring them against men. Yet, male and female bones do not display load in the same way, and a female skeleton, viewed as an incomplete male skeleton, can appear deceptively unremarkable. The result was an underreading of women's work on a civilizational scale. The bones had been speaking for decades. The method had been listening only for the male voice. Macintosh's team used CT scanning to look at the humerus, the bone of the upper arm, and the tibia in the lower leg. They compared living women of different activity levels, including rowers, runners, football players, and less active students, with prehistoric women from Central Europe, spanning the early Neolithic into later periods of farming life. The contrast was startling. Neolithic women from roughly 7,400 to 7,000 years ago had arm bones, 11 to 16% stronger for their size than the modern rowers, and almost 30% stronger than typical Cambridge students. Bronze Age women, several millennia later, still showed upper limb strength 9 to 13% greater than the rowers, even when their leg bones were less heavily loaded. That last detail is important because it tells you where to look. Earlier researchers often searched women's labour in the legs. If women were moving constantly across a landscape, perhaps their tibias would reveal it. But the strongest signal, again and again, was in the arms. These were women whose days were dominated by sustained manual effort. Their upper bodies were not incidental to subsistence. Their upper bodies were among its main instruments. The leg might travel. The arm transformed the world. And the arm, scan after scan, refused to look anything like the dainty wrist of cultural fantasy. Pause there and feel how different that is from the old cavewoman fantasy. Not passive, not sheltered, not waiting beside a fire for history to arrive in male hands. The strongest mechanical mark was in the place of lifting, scraping, grinding, carrying, hauling, shaping, striking, turning, pulling, wringing, cutting, and controlling. Once that becomes visible, one question rises immediately. What exactly were they doing for bone to respond at that level? The answer is not one task. The answer is a whole working life. The Cambridge team offered several candidates, and none of them belonged to a life of ease. Before the widespread use of ploughs, crops had to be planted, tilled, harvested, and processed by hand. Grain had to be turned into flour with a saddle quern. A grinding stone worked back and forth for long periods. In societies that continued this way of making flour into recent times, women could grind for up to 5 hours each day. Add to that milking, processing meat, moving water, managing animals, working hides and fibers, and the unending domestic industrial labour of a world without mechanization. And the picture begins to sharpen. The question is not why ancient women were so strong. The question is why we ever expected them not to be. J. Stock, the senior author of the study, put it plainly. For thousands of years, the rigorous manual labour of women was a crucial driver of early farming economies. Crucial, not auxiliary, not supplemental. Crucial. Yet even this finding, dramatic as it is, belongs mainly to the first farming societies and the millennia that followed them. Our title reaches deeper, into Paleolithic women, women who lived before fields organised the year. To understand why the farming evidence matters to a Paleolithic claim, we have to recognise that the farming women were already living in somewhat reduced bodies, compared to the foragers and hunter-gatherers who came before them. If early agricultural women had arms stronger than modern female athletes, what might women in more mobile, more physically demanding worlds have been like? The honest answer is that the bone hints at a baseline of female capacity in deep time that the modern world has almost no living comparison for. This is where another body of evidence enters, quieter in headline form but immense in meaning. The interior of load-bearing bone contains a spongy lattice called trabecular bone, a honeycomb structure that changes depending on how the body is used. Colin Shaw and his colleagues looked at this structure in ancient hip bones from populations in Illinois. Hunter-gatherers from around 7,000 years ago had far denser, thicker internal bone than farmers from the same region, more than 6,000 years later. The difference was around 20% in bone mass, comparable to what an average person would lose after 3 months of weightlessness in space. These foragers fell within the range expected for active primates of similar size. Farmers did not. The reduction tracked a reduction in activity. What does that mean in plain language? It means the skeleton tells the truth about movement. It means a body that walks farther, bears more, squats more, climbs more, runs more, and lives closer to necessity becomes a materially different body. The internal supports are more substantial. The body prepares for the world it is repeatedly asked to survive. The body of the forager was not exceptional within its own time. It was ordinary for its own time. What is exceptional is how far our ordinary has drifted from it. And because that shift from foraging to farming led to lighter bone, the strong-armed women of the Neolithic and Bronze Age are not the beginning of female physical power in human history. They are late survivors of a much older standard. They are what was left of an even greater capacity after the first reduction had already taken hold. The Paleolithic woman stands behind them, further back, in a body shaped by even more open country, even more direct contact with stone, skin, fibre, fuel, water and prey. There is another lesson hidden here. Modern people, especially modern people in industrial societies, tend to imagine strength visually. We think of display, outline, gym mirrors, biceps isolated by lighting, bodies designed for appearance or for brief peak performance. Ancient strength was far less theatrical and far more total. It lived in the whole frame. It lived in tissues trained not for one contest but for daily use. It often did not look like modern advertisement at all. A compact woman with an ordinary face, scarred hands, broad shoulders, and a lifetime of task memory in her joints may have possessed a work capacity that would have undone a much larger modern man by noon. The display body and the working body are not the same body. The Paleolithic produced the second kind, almost exclusively. That is one of the title's secret pivots. Stronger than modern men does not require every Paleolithic woman to defeat every modern man in every possible contest. It asks us to compare typical bodily demand with typical bodily demand, the life that shaped the skeleton with the life that shapes it now. Set against the office chair, the steering wheel, the escalator, the grocery cart, the processed floor, the warmed room, the electric mill, the plumbing line, the washing machine, the sleeping mattress, and the distance-removing machine culture of modern life. A Paleolithic woman's body begins to look less like a weaker version of man and more like a stronger version of human. The strength was not extraordinary inside its own world. It was unremarkable. It is only extraordinary now, against the backdrop of a species that has agreed to let machines carry most of what bodies once carried. There is tenderness in this realization too. Bones do not become powerful for glamorous reasons. They become powerful because life required it. Some of the strongest female bodies in history were shaped by obligations no one applauded. That is true in prehistory, and it remained true in many households until very recently. Labour can be both ordinary and immense. A woman can perform it for decades and have it vanish into a phrase like helping out, women's work, or what had to be done. Archaeology has become, among other things, one of the sciences capable of rescuing that vanished scale. The bones in those cemeteries are not only data points, they are receipts. They are the proof that work was done, even when no one stood over the worker to count. In the cemeteries used by Macintosh's team, women from the Serbian border into Western Germany had left behind precisely such a rescue. Their arm bones retain the memory of heavy, variable, repetitive work across centuries. Those women were not named for us, their bodies were. Their humeri spoke with such force that the comparison to modern elite rowers became possible. And once that became possible, it became impossible to go on pretending that female labour in the deep past was secondary. The skeleton had outlived the silence imposed upon it. The skeleton had waited patiently for the right pair of eyes. But bone does more than record labour. It also records method, the shape of a cross-section, the bias toward one limb or another, the relationship between upper and lower limb loading. All of this can hint at the patterns of motion that dominated a life. Among prehistoric women, upper limb loading remained a strong and persistent theme. That points us toward work done by hand, shoulder, and back. It points away from any comforting fantasy in which women lived closer to stillness than men did. The closer the science looked, the further stillness retreated as an explanation. What replaced it was motion in many directions, motion across many materials, motion across many seasons of a woman's life. If the oldest woman you called to mind in the hook spent years stirring, kneading, carrying, washing, sewing, wringing, or tending, you already know this truth in a domestic register. Some labours do not announce themselves as feats. They simply accumulate into a body. The shoulder becomes what the day required. The grip becomes what the decade required. The lower back becomes what family survival required. The difference in prehistory is that the stakes were more absolute and the materials more resistant. Animal skin does not yield politely. Frozen ground does not yield politely. Heavy water does not yield politely. Neither does a long day with no machine in sight. By the end of this chapter, the first promise of the title is partly visible. The bones really did prove unusual female strength. The evidence is not decorative, and it does not depend on mythic enthusiasm. It depends on measurable adaptation. Yet the title reaches one step farther still. It says Paleolithic women. Not only early farmers, not only village women, not only the long-suffering women of the dawn of agriculture. So our next movement must go where the body itself goes, when activity rises and civilization falls away. Deeper into time, deeper into movement, deeper into the raw human conditions under which female strength first became a necessity so constant that the skeleton learned to expect it. Because if the women of settled fields could outmatch modern athletes in the arms, what waits for us in the women who lived before the field was ever cut open? Chapter 2. The deeper we go into human time, the less modern pride helps us. Civilization taught us to admire our complexity, and often with good reason. We built archives, surgery, astronomy, law, cathedrals, engines, and songs that can still stop the heart. But the body keeps a separate ledger, and in that ledger many of the old advantages belong to people who lived with far fewer possessions and far more demand. This chapter belongs to that older ledger, and the older ledger is unforgiving to anyone who confuses comfort with capability. The human skeleton grew lighter after agriculture. That single sentence carries a quiet humiliation for the modern world. We are accustomed to narrating history as ascent, a staircase of improvement rising from cave to city, spear to satellite, darkness to illumination. But the skeleton does not flatter the staircase. In terms of habitual loading, several parts of the body move downward. As activity narrowed, bone narrowed with it. The trajectory of progress and the trajectory of bone strength turn out to be moving in opposite directions across long stretches of history. And the closer we look, the harder that contradiction is to wave away. When Colin Shaw's group compared the interior structure of hip bone across ancient populations, they were not measuring something theatrical. They were measuring the tiny internal struts inside the femoral head, the ball at the top of the thigh bone that sits in the pelvis. This region matters because it carries load repeatedly. Walk enough, run enough, carry enough, climb enough, squat enough, and that trabecular lattice thickens and organizes itself to meet the demand. Reduce the demand, and the lattice becomes less substantial. The difference between active hunter-gatherers and later agriculturalists in the Illinois material was not subtle. The foragers carried more actual bone in the internal structure and far less empty space. Their hips were quietly armored from the inside. For the listener tonight, there is a plain way to feel the meaning of that. Your skeleton is not simply your body's scaffolding. It is a long reply to what your days have asked of you. A girl who climbs, lifts, jumps, carries, runs, and spends her youth in repeated physical challenge builds one kind of future body. A girl kept still, compressed into polite inactivity, or separated from demanding movement, builds another. That truth can continue deep into adulthood, but childhood and early adult years matter especially, because the body is still negotiating its long contract with gravity. The contract signed in those years is the contract carried into old age, and the contract written in the Paleolithic was a contract for work without end. If you can, set one hand on your own forearm for a moment, just below the elbow, where the bone runs close under the skin. Feel that thin, firm line. That line was once, in your deep ancestresses, far thicker, far denser, far more obviously a tool. It was shaped by carrying water from distant sources, by working hide, by hauling fuel, by holding children whose weight grew month by month, by gripping cord and stone and bone. The forearm that lies under your hand tonight is the great many times granddaughter of forearms that did all of that. And the link between you and her is not metaphorical. It is the same bone, the same calcium, the same structural logic, only adapted to a different century. When Shaw spoke about the decline in bone strength after agriculture, he made a remark with an almost mythic sound to modern ears. There is no anatomical reason a person born today could not achieve the bone strength of an orangutan or an early human forager. The reason we do not is not that we were born incapable, it is that we do not load our bones in ways that would force such adaptation. We are not prevented by species, we are prevented by lifestyle. There is, in his words, 7 million years of hominid evolution geared toward action and physical activity for survival, and only in the last 50 to 100 years have we become so sedentary. dangerously so. The reduction is recent. The reduction is cultural. The reduction is reversible in principle, even if it never will be in practice for most of us. And if that is true for humans in general, it sets the stage for the women whose bodies we are tracing. Paleolithic women did not inhabit the softened environment that trains many modern skeletons toward fragility. They inhabited landscapes. They inhabited distances. They inhabited materials with refusal in them. The body they needed was not a body of occasional exertion. It was a body of routine exertion. A body for repeated carrying, sustained effort, cold weather resilience, unpredictable food return, and the practical management of children within movement rather than stillness. Their lives did not pause to allow them to be delicate. Their lives demanded that they be capable, and the bone became the receipt of that demand. Here the female question becomes sharper, because the old story assumed reproductive labor and physical strain cancelled one another out. Pregnancy, lactation, menstruation, childcare. These were treated as reasons women could not have taken part in the full muscular life of foraging and hunting. But this assumption is a modern projection laid over a body that tells a different tale. The female body is not a system designed only for rest and protection. It is a system built for endurance and fluctuation. Hormonal cycling does not erase capacity. It coordinates it. Pregnancy does not nullify strength. It alters its use. Lactation does not reduce a mother to immobility. Across much of human history, it occurred inside lives still filled with travel and work. The female body was never a body asking to be set aside. It was a body designed to keep going, often through conditions that would astonish anyone who has not lived inside it. Recent physiological work has drawn attention to features that make female bodies particularly suited to sustained effort. Estrogen encourages the use of stored fat during exercise, providing slower, longer-lasting energy. Women tend to possess a higher proportion of slow-twitch muscle fibers, which are less explosive but more resistant to fatigue. They often recover from prolonged effort differently from men and can maintain steadier pacing over long exertions. These are not small observations. They suggest that if a society depended heavily on endurance, tracking, carrying, repeated travel or persistence across difficult terrain, the female body was not a sideline body in that economy. It was a highly valuable design, perhaps in certain dimensions the better design. That line matters because the old cavewoman myth was built on burst power. It imagined hunting as a brief event of male force, a spear thrown in a single decisive moment, while women remained behind because brute impact belonged to men. But many forms of hunting, especially before recent weapons, were not only about a single strike. They involved knowledge, patience, pacing, route memory, weather reading, collective coordination, and the ability to keep moving when fatigue began to cloud judgment. The Paleolithic was full of long work disguised in popular imagination as sudden glory. The single throw is only the last second of a labour that may have lasted hours or days. And the labour that preceded the throw favoured exactly the endurance traits the female body carries most easily. There is a physical tenderness tucked into this part of the story. Older women listening tonight know better than young ideology that strength is not always loud. The strong woman is often the one who can keep going. She knows how to meter effort. She knows when to conserve and when to spend. She can carry while thinking ahead. She can work through discomfort because a task remains unfinished. The human past leaned heavily on that kind of strength, and the human past honoured it with bone density that most modern athletes would envy if they understood what they were looking at. And the body rewarded it with adaptation. Think of the female skeleton in deep time not as a diminished male frame, but as a specialised human frame under constant demand. The pelvis negotiated childbirth, yes, but the legs still had to move under it. The rib cage expanded with breath under exertion. The shoulders still needed to pull and stabilise. The hands still needed precision after fatigue. The spine still had to manage load. Paleolithic survival did not politely arrange tasks so that one system of the body could pause while another did the work. The body had to perform in every register at once, and the bone responded by becoming what every register required. There is a reason so many older romantic depictions of prehistory now look faintly ridiculous. The woman sits near the cave wall with perfect hair and soft wrists, while a man advances heroically with meat over one shoulder. It is bad art because it is bad mechanics. Life in mobile small groups did not permit that kind of theatrical separation between active and inactive bodies. Meat had to be cut, moved, dried, protected. Skins had to be processed. Children had to move with the group. Fuel had to be found. Water had to be carried. Tools had to be maintained. Knowledge had to be taught. Even shelter, in many environments, was not a permanent structure, but a recurring problem. There were no extras on the set of Paleolithic life. Every adult was a working principle, and the work did not lighten because the worker was female. All of this helps us answer the first part of the title's promise. Were Paleolithic women stronger than modern men? In the sense that matters to bone and habitual capacity, many of them almost certainly were stronger than many modern men. Their bodies were shaped by a level of consistent loading that the average modern male body never experiences. This is not a war between sexes. It is a comparison between ways of living. Modern men inherit cultural prestige from a story of ancestral masculinity, without inheriting the daily mechanical demands that once built truly robust human frames. Ancient women inherited no such prestige, but they inherited and lived the work. The bone, indifferent to prestige, records only the work. That is why the comparison stings. It reverses status. The group long granted symbolic power in the story of human strength often lives in bodies far less challenged than the supposedly secondary women of deep time ever did. The flattery of masculinity in this measurement has become a soft inheritance. The neglected dignity of femininity in this measurement has become a hard one. The bone is no respecter of how the story has been told. One of the hardest adjustments for modern imagination is accepting that people without modern training could surpass us in specific physical capacities simply because life trained them continuously. Training, after all, is merely chosen hardship arranged in the absence of necessity. Paleolithic people did not need a program. They needed dinner, shelter, warmth, material skill, and a live child at day's end. Their training was the world. The world wrote the program. The world enforced the program. The world reviewed performance every single day. And the bone passed. The listener may feel a faint ache here, not only of admiration but of recognition. Many women of the last century, especially those now in later life, were raised closer to necessity than younger generations. They carried shopping without wheels. They scrubbed by hand. They walked farther. They lifted children without ergonomic devices. They cooked from raw material. They bent, stood, and climbed through homes and work that demanded more bodily participation. Even that recent memory is enough to remind us how quickly comfort can erase a human baseline. Multiply that memory by 1,000. Remove engines and convenience, add exposure and uncertainty, and the Paleolithic body comes into view. Still, the body alone cannot finish the picture. To know that the skeleton was strong is one thing. To know what daily life filled that strength with is another. The next promise of the title waits there. What did these women actually do? What kinds of tasks could build arms and hips and backs that left such durable signatures? And how much of what they did has been made invisible simply because it was done by women? The answer lies not in one grand action, but in an entire economy of effort, from the famous tasks to the nearly forgotten ones. Strength, in the ancient female record, was rarely built by one spectacular gesture. It was built by the ordinary work on which spectacular moments depended. Chapter 3. If you want to understand how a body becomes formidable, it helps to stop imagining heroics and start imagining a day. Not a modern day broken into appointments and devices, but a Paleolithic day in which survival enters before speech is fully awake. Strength is much easier to romanticize from far away than to inhabit hour by hour. Yet, it is only in the hour by hour that ancient women come back into scale, and the scale is much larger than any modern shorthand permits. Morning begins before comfort has quite returned to the limbs. Air bites. Fire has either survived the night or must be coaxed back. Someone wakes hungry, someone wakes stiff. Someone wakes already listening for weather. The woman at the center of this day is not the female of a theory. She is a person with a task horizon in front of her. She must assess fuel, food, water, children, tools, movement, and the condition of others. Even in groups where labor was shared generously, shared labor still meant labor. Sharing did not reduce the total weight of the day. It only distributed it among people who could carry portions of it. This is where the modern listener may be surprised by familiarity. The day begins with inventory. What is there? What is missing? What must be repaired? Who needs tending first? Which small tasks cannot be delayed because they will become large tasks if ignored? Ancient life was harsher, but the intelligence of female management has its echoes. Countless women across later centuries have begun the day in the same mode, already 3 steps ahead of everyone else, because the body remembers what the household, camp, or family will demand before it says so aloud. There is a particular alertness that older women carry into a morning, a scanning attention that registers what others have not yet noticed. That alertness has very deep roots. Now add movement. Paleolithic groups were often mobile, seasonally mobile, or at least deeply engaged with the land around them. Water was not turned by a tap. Fuel was not stacked in a delivery shed. Children were not parked in a separate room while adult life proceeded elsewhere. Distance, even a modest one, multiplies effort when every object has weight and nothing comes on wheels. A baby on the hip changes the mechanics of every task. A skin sack of water changes them again. A bundle of gathered material presses them further. The body adjusts not once but over and over, and the skeleton notes the repetition. The spine learns to brace. The hip learns to angle. The shoulder learns to compensate. The neck learns to balance. None of this is decided consciously. It is decided by use. Some tasks that look small from a drawing are enormous from the wrist. Scraping a hide, for instance, is not a delicate feminine pastime in any sentimental sense. It is resistant work. The hide must be stabilized, the tool gripped, the angle controlled, the force repeated, the shoulder anchored, the back engaged. It may go on for long stretches. Cold can stiffen hands. Fat can slick the surface. The work must still be done cleanly enough to produce warmth later. Anyone who has done repetitive manual work with a stubborn material knows how quickly a few minutes can become a deep ache running from fingers through forearm into shoulder. The ache, done over years, is one path toward the kind of upper limb adaptation ancient women carried. Then there is carrying. Modern life hides the severity of carrying by replacing it with transport. The Paleolithic did not. Carrying a child is not separate from carrying life. It is carrying life. Carrying fuel, tools, plants, meat, skins, cords, vessels, and gathered materials is not decorative labor around the edges of subsistence. It is the movement of subsistence itself. Load carriage reorganizes gait, spine, hip, shoulder, and balance. Do it daily across varied ground, and the body becomes a different map of force. Studies of women who continue traditional load carrying today have shown body adaptations that fascinate sports scientists, including unusually efficient walking economies under heavy load. The female body, given long training from youth, can become extraordinarily good at translating distance into delivered weight. The Paleolithic was full of such bodies because the Paleolithic could not function without them. There are moments in archaeology when a site flashes like a lantern, showing not the whole world but one unforgettable corner of it. Sungir, east of modern Moscow, is one such site. Around 34,000 years ago, people there buried their dead with extraordinary care and wealth. Beads, ochre, ivory, antlers, spears. Among the most famous burials are 2 young individuals placed head to head, one likely a girl of around 9 to 11 years old, buried with remarkable objects, including mammoth ivory spears, an offering of what were probably valuable hunting tools. The significance is not that we can assign one tidy meaning to every grave good. The significance is that the old expectation of simple male prestige and female marginality keeps failing against the material record. The world that buried a girl with such symbolic and practical force was not organized around our cartoon of female insignificance. Another lantern burns at Dolny Vestonice in Moravia, where Upper Paleolithic people left burials, dwellings, figurines, and evidence of elaborate social life. Among its famous finds is the burial of a woman placed with care in a complex ritual context, an older woman whose face was even partially modelled in a way that suggests deep social memory. Again, the point is not to turn every grave into an uncomplicated claim about equality. The point is that women appear in the deep record not as invisible annexes to male life, but as beings around whom ritual attention, artistic attention, and social meaning could organize themselves. The figurines so often associated with this era and others, sometimes called Venus figurines, may have had many meanings, but they unmistakably testify that the female body was a central object of human attention in deep time, not a peripheral one. Daily life then took place inside worlds where women were visible enough to be buried memorably, skilled enough to shape materials that rarely survive, and necessary enough to leave mechanical signatures in bone. The question is not whether they participated, the question is how vast the range of their participation really was. The honest answer is that the range was almost certainly enormous, far broader than any single textbook image has ever shown. Picture a woman in late Ice Age Europe moving between tasks. She has already assessed a skin drying near the fire, checked a child's foot, adjusted a carrying strap, and walked for water or fuel. Later, she may join others in processing plant foods, cutting meat, breaking bone for marrow, preparing sinew, maintaining a tool edge, or travelling to a known patch of useful materials. None of this requires us to force every woman into every task every day. Human groups have always distributed labour flexibly according to age, season, health, skill, need and circumstance. The deeper point is that the distribution was never between active human and inactive female. That distribution belongs to bad storytelling, not to Paleolithic mechanics. There is grief in the older scholarship now, if you read it long enough. So much female work was missed, not because it left no trace, but because investigators did not ask the right questions. When women's skeletons did not resemble men's in predictable ways, the labour was presumed absent or mild. When hunting tools lay with a female burial, alternative explanations multiplied. When ethnographers recorded women hunting, those lines were treated as exceptions rather than as instructions to redraw the whole picture. Bias rarely arrives announcing itself as hostility. More often it arrives as an unnoticed default, a habit of attention that points one way without ever explaining why. The habit takes decades to break, and the breaking is itself a kind of labour. And still the evidence persisted. One can almost hear the soundscape of this day if one stays close enough. Scrape of stone on hide, tap of bone against another material, the hush of breath while hands do precise work, a child's complaint, voices carrying information rather than small talk, the drag and shift of a load, fire crackle, wind. The kind of fatigue that does not ask whether one feels inspired, fatigue that simply enters the arms and must be worked through because the task sits unfinished. Older women know something about that form of time. Fatigue does not always end a day's demand, often it merely accompanies the rest of it. That is why the body bridge between the Paleolithic woman and the listener tonight is not fanciful. The technologies differ, the social worlds differ, the dangers differ, but there is an older female grammar in which responsibility and exertion are braided together. A woman keeps moving because others depend on the motion. That has been true in huts, farmhouses, apartments, refugee lines, suburban kitchens, hospital corridors, and factory floors. What changes are the materials. What remains is the bodily intelligence of carrying life forward under load. Still, one part of the ancient female day has remained unusually stubborn in public imagination: hunting. Even people willing to grant women hard domestic or craft labour often hesitate at the chase, the kill, the pursuit of large animals, the use of projectile tools. It is as if one last male sanctuary must be defended against all the rest of the evidence. And yet the closer we move toward the real tasks that built ancient women's bodies, the harder that sanctuary becomes to maintain. The doorway is already cracked. The hinges are already loosening. The walls of that last sanctuary will not hold once the full record steps in. Before we go there directly, we need to spend time with the skilled labours that sat beside hunting and made hunting possible. The Paleolithic world did not separate production from support the way modern language often does. Making clothing, preparing cords, treating hides, shaping containers, processing plant fibres, controlling fire, and managing loads were not secondary to the acquisition of food. They were part of the same survival economy. A hunter without clothing freezes. A group without cordage loses options. A carcass without skilled processing becomes waste. Children without transport slow the band. Meat without storage vanishes. The labour that surrounded the kill was as essential as the kill itself, and often more constant. So the next movement in our story turns towards the hands, the shoulders, and the patient female disciplines that do not usually headline a civilization's self-image, though entire worlds once rested on them. Because strength is not only built in pursuit, it is also built in transformation, when resistant materials are persuaded, hour after hour, into shelter, warmth, transport, and continuity. Chapter 4. If large animals and dramatic hunts dominate the popular image of prehistory, the quieter arts of survival often disappear behind them. Yet the body does not disappear them. The arm that scrapes, sews, twists, smooths, carries, cuts and braces can become every bit as changed by long discipline as the arm that throws. In some cases more so. This is the chapter where the invisible workshop of Paleolithic women begins to return. And the workshop turns out to have been one of the engines of the species itself. Clothing is one place to start, because modern people forget how total a problem exposure used to be. Cold was not a minor inconvenience to be solved by central heating and synthetic fleece. Cold entered the body as a direct threat. To move into northern latitudes and survive, human groups needed skins prepared, softened, cut, pierced, fitted, repaired, and layered. That required technique. It required time. It required tools. It required hands strong enough to impose order on stubborn animal material. Without that labour, no glacier-edge settlement was possible. Without that labour, human expansion across cold Eurasia could not have happened on the scale it did. Clothing is not a decorative footnote to human prehistory. It is one of its load-bearing walls. The archaeological record for clothing is indirect because fabric and skin rarely survive. But the tools of clothing work do survive often enough to sketch an impressive map. Stone hide scrapers appear deep in the Paleolithic, at sites such as Hoxne, Kesem Cave, and Schöningen. Bone smoothers associated with skin working have been found in places including Schöningen, Grotte des Contrebandiers in Morocco, Piche de la Zay, Combe Grenelle, Abri Peyroni, and the Grotte du Rennes, where some examples date to roughly 45 to 42,000 years ago. Bone awls appear across Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Eyed needles emerge by around 40,000 years ago in Siberia, and later appear at Denisova Cave, Yana, Zhoukoudian Upper Cave, and other sites. A recent find from Cañars in Iberia showed puncture marks consistent with perforating leather nearly 40,000 years ago. Each of these objects represents many hours of handwork, and many of those hours were almost certainly female. Those names may seem like a shower of distant locations, but together they describe something intimate. Human bodies, many of them female bodies, engaged in the prolonged making of wearable shelter. When we imagine a woman sewing in recent centuries, we understand at once that sewing can become a full-body task, especially when the material is thick. Multiply the toughness of the material, remove artificial light, remove steel needles, remove machine assistance, add cold, and the level of exertion rises sharply. Ancient clothing was not quaint handiwork. It was a survival industry done at arm's length from injury and weather. The hands mattered, but so did the shoulders and back. To prepare a hide for use, the worker must stabilize it, stretch it, scrape tissue away, soften the surface, sometimes smoke or treat it, and continue until the skin becomes workable rather than rigid. Each stage asks for grip endurance, repeated arm motion, trunk stability, and patience. The bone does not care that later historians might call this domestic. The bone only registers that it was hard. And it was hard not for an hour, but for the duration of a working life. Now think of fibre. Cordage changes what a society can do. With cords, nets, straps, ties, slings, bindings and woven containers become possible. Loads can be secured. Infants can be carried more efficiently. Structures can be stabilized. Meat can be hung. Tools can be hafted. Technological complexity is not only the story of points and blades, it is also the story of ties, loops, twists, knots, and woven strength. Many of those achievements vanish because plant material perishes. On rare occasions, preservation gives us a glimpse, and the glimpse is enough to reveal an entire hidden architecture. Cueva de los Murciélagos in southern Spain, though later than the Paleolithic proper, offers one of those glimpses into the technical intelligence of ancient plant work. There, archaeologists recovered baskets, mats, sandals, cords, wooden implements, and other fibre-based objects dating from Mesolithic and Neolithic phases, roughly from the 8th to 5th millennia BCE. The site shows extraordinary knowledge of esparto grass, including differing treatments of raw and crushed fibres to alter flexibility and use. The objects are beautiful, but their deeper lesson is about labour. A sophisticated fibre tradition does not emerge from occasional tinkering. It emerges from people who live inside materials, who know where to gather them, when to harvest them, how to cure them, how to split them, how to twist them, how to weave strain into durability. That kind of knowledge is built across generations, taught hand to hand, and almost always carried by women. It is not difficult to imagine women as central to such traditions, not because one must force every craft into female hands, but because ethnography and later history repeatedly show women at the heart of transport technologies, containers, textiles, child-carrying systems, and the practical architecture of daily life. The body signatures of ancient women, heavily marked in the upper limbs, fit perfectly with worlds in which such skill was constant. This is where the old phrase women's work becomes almost unbearable in its smallness. What did that phrase manage to shrink? It shrank the transformation of raw hide into warmth. It shrank the transformation of plant fiber into transport. It shrank the transformation of animal body into food, clothing, cord, glue, bedding, and ornament. It shrank the maintenance of tools and children alike. It shrank the millions of repetitions by which female bodies built the human environment from resistant matter. Two words, designed to fit on a small label, were forced to hold an entire civilizational engine. They could not. They never could. They only succeeded in making the engine invisible to people who preferred not to see it. Picture a woman seated or crouched over a skin as daylight angles low. Her forearms are tired already, but the surface is not yet ready. Beside her lies another material waiting its turn. Sinew to be cleaned and separated, a broken binding to repair, a container to rework, a child's wrap to tighten, a cutting edge to check. The motions are not large, but they are forceful. Her fingers ache, her shoulder burns. She keeps going because unfinished material is future cold. The day will not lengthen because she is tired. The cold will not retreat because she is sore. The work meets her where she is, and her body answers from where it stands. This chapter also asks us to reconsider beauty in the archaeological record. The beads at Sunhir, the figurines at Dolní Věstonice, the carefully worked sandals and baskets of later prehistoric Spain, the polished surfaces of bone tools, the symmetry of some implements. None of this belongs to a world divided between male function and female decoration. Beauty and utility were interwoven. To make something durable, fitted, and workable often meant making it beautiful as well, because symmetry, tension, proportion, and finish are practical virtues before they become aesthetic ones. A poorly balanced basket spills, a poorly cut garment chafes, a poorly twisted cord breaks. Beauty in ancient making was very often the visible face of competence. That matters because female skill has often been exiled into prettiness, as though beauty were the opposite of hard labour. In many traditional crafts, the opposite is true. Beauty is what hard labour looks like when it becomes highly competent. A well-fitted garment is beautiful because someone mastered material resistance. A well-woven basket is beautiful because someone calculated strain. A well-prepared hide is beautiful because someone's tired arms brought refusal under control. And when those tired arms repeat their task over years, they become powerful in ways modern observers may fail to notice if they are looking for masculine display. The shoulder broadens functionally. The grip acquires economy. The trunk learns stability. The wrists strengthen through practice. This is not a cinematic strength of one great act. It is a workshop strength, a hearth strength, a carrying strength, a production strength. It is often the kind of strength that modern societies least know how to admire because it comes without applause. Older women understand that invisibility well. Entire generations were praised for devotion, while the labour itself remained unnamed. A woman was called good, reliable, tireless, generous, dutiful, capable. Rarely was she called physically powerful, though power had been flowing through her all day. The Paleolithic record does not flatter modern language either. It keeps showing us female exertion substantial enough to remodel bone. And yet one more objection usually waits. Craft is one thing, the objection says. Carrying and hide work are one thing. The dangerous edge of food acquisition is another. Surely men still owned that frontier. Surely the spear, the projectile, the pursuit of large game, the risk of bodily collision, the decisive violence of the hunt belonged mainly to them. The answer to that objection requires us to move from workshop to social world, from tool to group, from isolated tasks to coordinated survival. Because the hunt, like everything else in prehistory, did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in bands, families, kin groups, and alliances where children had to be watched, knowledge had to be passed, and the division of labour had to make sense not to modern fantasy, but to actual human necessity. And once we enter that social world, the old border between women's labour and men's labour begins to blur until the line itself looks like something drawn centuries later by hands that had never lived in a Paleolithic camp. Chapter 5. A human band survives not by isolated excellence, but by coordinated usefulness. That simple truth should have made the old man the hunter and woman the gatherer picture suspect from the beginning. Small groups living in dangerous environments do not have the luxury of wasting adult capacity, because a later ideology prefers neat roles. What they need is competence, distributed across the people available, with flexibility enough to absorb sickness, injury, weather, childbirth, bad luck, migration, and sudden death. The Paleolithic could not afford the modern dream of strict separation. It needed every working body, every adult mind, every pair of skilled hands. One of the most revealing features of Paleolithic life is that it appears, again and again, as shared strain. Neanderthal remains from Western and Central Eurasia show female and male bodies carrying many of the same kinds of trauma and wear. The pattern is not one of sheltered women preserved from danger, while men absorb all the hard edges of life. It is a pattern of broadly comparable hardship. Tooth wear associated with using the front teeth as a third hand appears across sexes, implying repeated material processing in both. Bodily trauma indicates difficult conditions for both. These are not the signatures of separate worlds. These are the signatures of one shared world, in which everyone old enough and well enough to work, worked. The same broad theme continues into Upper Paleolithic modern humans. The skeletal record does not support a dramatic opposition between active males and inactive females. Some differences exist, including greater evidence in males for certain throwing-related pathologies. But even there the contrast is not total. Some females show comparable marks. A strict division collapses into overlap, variability, and shared participation. That matters, because overlap is what real life usually looks like when groups must remain adaptive. Real life almost never matches the diagram. The diagram is for the textbook. The bone is for the body, and the body did what the body had to do. Burials tell another part of the story. At Sungkya, as we have seen, young individuals were buried with astonishing care and objects of obvious value. At least one was likely female. What matters here is not only status, but imagination. A community does not pour time, labour, ivory, beads, ochre, and crafted objects into a burial unless the dead person occupied moral and social significance. Female, or possibly female bodies in such contexts disturb any notion that the symbolic centre of Paleolithic life belonged to men alone. The investment was real. The investment in a girl was as real as the investment in a boy. The ritual world of these people had room for female centrality in a way that later ideology could not always tolerate. In later discussions of female burials, the temptation is always to minimize. Perhaps the tools were symbolic, not practical. Perhaps grave goods do not reflect ordinary life. Perhaps the object belonged to the group, not the individual. Perhaps. And yet, one begins to notice that every time an artifact appears beside a female body, explanation grows inventive in one direction only, away from female agency. Male burials seldom need such rescue from implication. A spear beside a man is a hunter. A spear beside a woman is suddenly a symbol, an heirloom, an accident, a ceremonial gesture, anything except what it would have plainly meant if the bones had been the other sex. This is not merely a scholarly annoyance. It shapes how whole populations imagine their origins. If hunting tools lie with a female body, and we instantly look for reasons they do not mean hunting, while male bodies with similar goods are granted the identity of hunter without strain, we are not reading the past. We are defending a myth. The defence is unconscious, well-mannered, often quite gentle in tone, but it is still defence, and it has cost the female past more than any single missing artefact ever could. The social logic of hunter-gatherer life also pushes against that myth. Childcare in mobile foraging societies is often cooperative. Grandmothers, older siblings, fathers, aunts, and other group members contribute. The isolated nuclear family is a poor model for much of human evolution. When a group shares childcare, the old argument that women must remain spatially fixed because of children weakens substantially. A mother may hunt, gather, process, travel, or craft, while others support the child. A child may accompany adults during many tasks. Among the AGTA of the Philippines, women hunt even while pregnant, lactating, or accompanied by children. That is not an eccentric modern exception. It is a reminder that female bodies and female social worlds have long been more flexible than patriarchal storytelling preferred. Now imagine the human band with that flexibility in place. An older woman watches an infant, while two younger women join a pursuit or check traps. A man returns first with partial information, while others continue a task elsewhere. Children learn by proximity rather than through separated instruction. Tasks overlap. Food sources vary. Some days involve more gathering, some more processing, some more travel, some more direct pursuit. This is not chaos. It is adaptive complexity. In such a world, competence matters more than symbolic purity of role. There is a bodily lesson here that listeners in later life may feel almost immediately. Families and households, especially under pressure, rarely survive by theory. They survive by whoever can do what needs doing. The one who can cook also carries. The one who can soothe also lifts. The one who can manage money also scrubs. The one who can comfort the sick also walks to fetch medicine. Human groups under demand blur categories because reality insists. Paleolithic groups living much closer to bare reality had even more reason to blur them. Consider also the energy economics. Hunting large game is not always a constant event. It can be infrequent, risky, and variable. A band cannot organize itself around the fantasy that one category of adult delivers all critical calories while another category merely waits. Plant foods, small game, fish, trapped animals, collected resources, processed stores, and technical work all support subsistence. When hunting is successful, processing the return becomes massive labor. Meat must be cut, portions managed, marrow extracted, hides treated, bones utilized, transport arranged. The idea that one sex alone owns the dignity of food while the other performs the drudgery of making food usable is itself a late social arrangement, disguised as natural law. This is one reason the female strength question widens into a civilization question. When female labor becomes visible, human success starts to look less like a male adventure supported by women, and more like a female-male collaboration, in which women often bore enormous shares of both visible and invisible demand. The story of human survival becomes more honest the moment it admits the size of female participation. The honesty is not a favor to women. It is a correction to a record that had grown crooked. There is emotion in that recognition, especially if you were raised on stories that gave men the event and women the aftermath. Many women know what it means to live in the aftermath, to clean after, mend after, cook after, soothe after, bury after, continue after. The Paleolithic record complicates that deeply. Women were not only the people who handled what came after male action, they were often among the people whose action made the after possible in the first place. A striking example arrives from discussions of early projectile technologies. Atlatls, or spear throwers, can reduce the advantage of larger body size by increasing leverage and velocity. Experimental work with modern users suggests that such technology could have narrowed differences between men and women in projectile performance. Annemiek Milks at UCL has emphasized this point repeatedly. Atlatls may well have acted as equalizers, facilitating hunting by both women and men, possibly because they reduce the importance of body size and strength. Some present-day atlatl competitions include women and children regularly. A tool like that changes the social geometry of hunting. Skill, timing, practice, and coordination rise in importance. Raw upper body size loses some of its tyranny. Once again, the female body looks less excluded by nature and more invited by adaptation. The old image of men standing at the front of danger, while women inhabit safety, also misreads danger itself. Gathering can be dangerous. Processing large carcasses can be dangerous. Traveling with children across open country can be dangerous. Working hides with stone tools can be dangerous. Caring for the injured can be dangerous. Cold is dangerous. Infection is dangerous. Birth is dangerous. The Paleolithic did not offer women a protected zone free from risk. It offered a world in which risk and necessity often overlapped, and the women who lived inside that overlap did not hide from it. They met it, day after day, with the same body they would later carry into old age if they were fortunate enough to reach it. That makes the hierarchy of prestige attached to hunting look increasingly artificial. Much of what kept groups alive took place outside the heroic spotlight. The more archaeology uncovers about ancient women, the more we see that prestige and necessity were never neatly aligned. A woman scraping, carrying, sewing, teaching, gathering, checking traps, or helping organize a kill may have been every bit as crucial to survival as the man who delivered a spear at the right moment. The spear belongs to the story we told. The skin, the cord, the fuel, the child, the route, the medicine, the meat in cut portions belong to the story that kept us alive. The challenge, then, is not only to prove that women were strong, that part is already underway. The challenge is to restore a social world in which female strength makes sense. Without that world, every new piece of evidence will keep getting dragged back toward our familiar myths. The myth is comfortable, the myth is short, the truth is longer, and it requires patience to receive. So let us move now to the hidden knowledge itself, not only the obvious tasks, but the forms of expertise that made movement, hunting, carrying, and material survival possible, because strength without skill is waste, and the ancient female body was not a blunt instrument. It was a trained intelligence under load. Chapter 6. A strong body is only half an answer. The other half is what that body knows. Paleolithic women were not simply muscled by hardship. They were educated by it. Their knowledge lived in touch, timing, route memory, season sense, reading of signs, control of pace, management of children in motion, and the thousand small judgments by which a day either held together or failed. This chapter belongs to knowledge so embodied that later historians often missed it entirely, mistaking quiet expertise for absence of expertise, simply because it did not announce itself in writing. Take tracking in the broad sense. Not only the glamorous image of pursuing hoofprints through mud, tracking includes noticing absence as much as presence. It includes remembering where animals crossed last season, where a certain plant ripens first on a south-facing slope, where water holds longest, where wind strips scent, where ice forms dangerously thin, where shelter can be improvised, where a child can safely walk, where a child must be carried, and which route costs fewer calories in a lean period. Such knowledge does not sit in the mind alone. It organizes feet, hips, breath, and decisions. It is physical intelligence. The body becomes a kind of map, and the map is updated every season for the rest of a working life. Women in foraging societies have often held dense local ecological knowledge. That matters because foraging is not simply wandering about and picking things up. It is informed recovery of calories, medicine, fibers, fuel, and materials from a complex environment. Done well, it requires memory and strong movement. Done while carrying a child or returning with a load, it demands even more. Add occasional hunting, trapping, fishing, or netting, and the picture broadens beyond anything the old model allowed. The forager is not a passive collector. The forager is an applied ecologist whose practical knowledge would astonish most modern professionals if they tried to spend a single week inside her working day. The ethnographic reanalysis published in 2023, led by Kara Wall-Scheffler and including Abigail Anderson and Sarah Lacey among contributors to the broader conversation about female hunting and physiology, made the older silences impossible to ignore. Across 63 foraging societies with usable descriptions, women were documented hunting in 50 of them, about 79%. In societies where hunting was the most important subsistence activity, women participated 100% of the time. In the cases where intent was described, women's hunting was intentional far more often than opportunistic. They hunted small game, medium game, and in many societies large game as well. Some hunted with dogs, some hunted with children. That last detail is especially beautiful in its defiance of modern simplification. Childcare and hunting were not always opposing states. Sometimes they travelled together, and the children grew up watching exactly how it was done. You, listening now, may know exactly how radical and how ordinary that sounds. Women often do not get a separate life for each duty. They braid duties. They do one thing while carrying another. They think about tomorrow while finishing today. The prehistoric record begins to look very female in that familiar sense. Tasks are stacked, not separated. When an older woman kneads dough, lifts bedding, turns soil, wrings cloth, tends a patient, or steadies herself on stairs after years of work. There is often a memory in the hands that words do not fully reach. If you are listening from a kitchen, a bedroom, a porch, a hospital room, a late-night living room, or any quiet corner where the day has only just loosened its grip on your shoulders, I would love to know what hour it is where you are and what kind of work your hands remember best, because ancient labour was counted in light and muscle, and our bodies still keep time that way even now. Skill also changes how we understand force. A woman using an atlatl, a net, a trap, or a carefully organised communal strategy does not need to duplicate the exact mechanics of an unassisted male spear cast in order to contribute decisively to hunting. Technology is the extension of intelligence into material form. It redistributes possibility. The Paleolithic is full of such redistributions: hooks, lines, throwing devices, cords, slings, baskets, carrying gear, stitched clothing, prepared surfaces, adhesive compounds. All of these altered who could do what and how efficiently. The arrival of any well-made tool is in part a redistribution of who is permitted by physics to take part. That is why the phrase better suited must be used carefully. No sex owned all useful traits. Men on average possessed certain advantages in burst power and size. Women on average possessed certain advantages in endurance, pacing, fat utilization, and often fine control under fatigue. Technology and cooperation allowed groups to turn these overlapping strengths into shared subsistence. A world built around only one style of body would have been a brittle world. Human success came from plural capacity, and plural capacity required both sexes to be working, thinking, moving, and contributing across the full range of what a band needed in any given week. Look again at the upper limb strength found in prehistoric women. It does not point to one single task, because ancient women were probably doing many. Grain grinding appears later and helps explain some farming signatures. But in earlier foraging worlds, the same mechanical intensity could come from hide work, carrying, climbing, tool manufacture, processing food, paddling in some regions, hauling fuel, digging, or repeated use of weapon systems. The variation itself tells a story. Women were not confined to one narrow occupational lane. Their bodies had to answer multiple demands. The arm that grinds is also the arm that scrapes. The arm that scrapes is also the arm that lifts. The arm that lifts is also the arm that throws when the moment requires it. This helps explain why so much female labour slipped from view. Archaeologists love signatures that map neatly onto one task, one tool, one motion, one identity. Real lives are messier. Women's work especially has often consisted of a dense cluster of activities rather than one prestigious specialization. Yet that very density can build extraordinary capacity. Variety of labor is not lesser labor. It is one reason a body becomes broadly strong, rather than narrowly trained. The Paleolithic woman, in this sense, was less like a modern specialist athlete, and more like a versatile working professional, whose every working hour widened her physical repertoire. There is also the matter of teaching. Knowledge in prehistoric societies moved through bodies long before it moved through writing. Children watched, imitated, practiced, failed and practiced again. A girl learning to split fibre, to soften skin, to judge a load, to move over rock without wasting energy, to use a cutting edge safely, to read a weather change, or to keep a child balanced while walking, was not merely helping. She was entering a discipline. Skill transmission itself is labour, and women likely stood near its centre, in many domains. A whole culture, generation after generation, was passed through female hands as much as through male voices, and the passing left its own marks on female bodies. That matters for another reason. Modern prestige often attaches to innovation while treating maintenance as lesser. Yet in mobile hunter-gatherer life, maintenance is a form of innovation stretched across time. To keep a group clothed, carried, fed, and moving requires constant micro-adjustment. The person who keeps systems working is not secondary to the person who first made them. Many women know how often a family, workplace, or community survives on maintenance intelligence rather than on celebrated breakthroughs. That pattern may be very old, and the bone strength of ancient women may, in part, be the physical record of unending maintenance carried out without celebration. There are brief moments in archaeology when we glimpse the hidden curriculum of women with unusual clarity: a buried toolkit, a wear pattern, a cluster of plant artifacts, a repaired object, a body with asymmetries produced by repeated motion, a burial whose goods imply skill, not ornament alone. These flashes are enough to make the old passive image feel less like error and more like refusal. The record had been speaking, the audience had been turning the page, and so we arrive at the threshold of the strongest reversal in this whole story. If women held deep ecological knowledge, if they possessed endurance-favouring physiology, if they used technologies that reduced the brute size advantage of males, if they lived in cooperative bands with shared childcare and overlapping roles, and if archaeological evidence keeps placing hunting tools and hunting signatures near female bodies, then the old claim that serious hunting made men the central actors of human evolution begins to collapse from every side at once. The next chapter is where that collapse finally happens in full view. Because it is one thing to say women worked hard, it is another to say women hunted, and not as rare exceptions, not as footnotes, not as companions, but as participants so regular that the oldest story about who made us human has to be rewritten. Chapter 7. The strongest revelation in this story is not that Paleolithic women were useful. Everyone sensible already knew that, even if some traditions tried to hide the scale. The strongest revelation is sharper and more disorienting. The very category of man the hunter, which shaped generations of textbooks, museum scenes, and casual common sense, collapses once female physiology and archaeological evidence are read together, not softens, not receives a minor qualification, collapses. And the collapse rearranges almost everything that was built on top of it. For decades, the hunting story carried a double prestige. It gave men the principal role in the most dramatic form of food acquisition, and it linked that role to the making of the human mind itself. Men, according to this story, evolved through pursuit, strategy, cooperation, and weapon use. Women waited nearby, contributing but not defining the species. The elegance of the myth was part of its appeal. The trouble is that the body and the burial both refuse it. The myth was elegant only because it had been allowed to ignore most of the evidence. Let us begin with the body. Modern exercise physiology has drawn increasing attention to traits that favour female endurance. Women tend to use more fat for fuel during prolonged exercise, supported by estrogen's role in metabolism. Fat yields sustained energy over time. Women also tend to possess a higher proportion of slow-twitch muscle fibres, which are less explosive but more resistant to fatigue. Estrogen appears to affect muscle preservation and recovery as well. The work of Sarah Lacey at the University of Delaware and Kara Wall-Scheffler at Seattle Pacific University drew these strands together in publications that quietly demolished some of the oldest assumptions in the field. The result is not that women win every contest, but that the female body is exceptionally well suited to long, steady effort. That matters enormously for hunting in pre-industrial contexts. Hunting can require long-distance travel, patient pursuit, repeated attempts, careful pacing, steady attention, and continued function while tired. The more hunting relies on endurance and coordination rather than sheer momentary impact, the less sense it makes to treat women as biologically outside its core. Persistence hunting, in which prey is run to exhaustion across hours, may not have favoured brute size at all. It may have favoured the body that does not break down across distance. That body is often female. Now set that physiology beside archaeology. In 2020, Randall Hass and colleagues published the study of Willamea Pachak in the high Andes of southern Peru. There, archaeologists found the 9,000-year-old burial of a young adult female, around 17 to 19 years old, placed with a hunting toolkit that included projectile points and animal processing tools. Proteomic analysis confirmed her biological sex. This was not a vague symbolic association. It was a burial in which a young woman lay beside the equipment of a hunter, and beside her in the burial fill lay large mammal bones, evidence of what her society's hunting actually targeted. By itself, that would already demand attention. But the study went farther. Hass and colleagues reviewed burial data from sites across the Americas and found that of 27 individuals associated with big game hunting tools whose sex could be determined, around 41% were likely female. Their statistical analysis suggested that female participation in early big game hunting in this region likely fell between 30 and 50%. That is not token presence. That is a hunting world, in which women belong inside the normal picture, not on the edge of it. There is something almost heartbreaking about how long it took for such evidence to be heard at its true volume. The female hunter was not unimaginable because the past excluded her. She was unimaginable because modern interpreters had already excluded her before they looked. The data had been waiting. The discipline had been looking past it. UCL archaeologist Annemieke Milks noted another detail that matters greatly here. Some projectile technologies, such as the atlatl, likely reduce the importance of body size and strength. Women and children can use spear throwers effectively. Experimental work supports the idea that such tools may have acted as equalizers. Human beings do not hunt only with naked anatomy. They hunt with systems. Any system that rewards aim, timing, leverage, and cooperation weakens the argument for strict male monopoly. The system, in fact, was often designed to invite many bodies, not to repel them. And still, the evidence reaches beyond Wilhelmina Pacha. The 2023 ethnographic study of foraging societies showed women hunting in 79% of the societies examined. In contexts where hunting was the most important subsistence activity, women participated in all recorded cases. Some hunted with infants or young children present. Among the Agtiae of the Philippines, women have been documented as primary hunters. This does not prove that every Paleolithic society organized hunting exactly as every recent forager does. It proves something equally vital. Women hunting is not alien to human life. It is recurring, practical, adaptive, and widespread in environments as varied as tropical forest, mountain steppe, boreal woodland, and desert margin. The female body, then, was not disqualified by nature. The social world was not universally organized against it. The technologies did not always block it. The archaeological record keeps revealing it. The ethnographic record keeps retaining it. The old barrier survives mostly in story. Here is the deeper emotional force of that. For generations, women were told that one of the most prestigious human tasks had always belonged elsewhere. The hunt made man, people said. And by implication, woman arrived after the making. Yet, what if women were there in the making? What if women were not waiting at the edge of the species, while men entered history, but were themselves part of the long bodily education through which humanity learned endurance, tracking, tool use, coordinated pursuit, and survival under pressure? The species was not built by half of itself, it was built by all of itself, with the female half engaged in every domain the survival required. The title becomes heavier at that point. Stronger than modern men no longer sounds like a mere physical comparison. It becomes part of a larger reversal. The modern male, socially flattered by ancient myth, may in many cases live in a body less challenged, less adapted, less capable of sustained survival labour than the Paleolithic women whose contribution the myth erased. The flattery has been mistaken for inheritance. The inheritance in its bodily form has gone elsewhere. Think of the young woman at Wilhelmina Pacha. She died young, as many did. Yet the toolkit buried with her says that in the brief span she lived, she belonged to the dangerous, skilled world of hunting. Her society saw no contradiction strong enough to prevent that burial from being made. The contradiction came later, from us. Her people had no trouble understanding what she had been. Our people had trouble understanding what she had been only because our people had built a theory that left no room for her. One can feel the entire old narrative bend there, and once it bends, many scattered facts begin to align. Shared trauma patterns among Neanderthal women and men. Overlap in Upper Paleolithic repetitive motion signatures. Female grave goods with hunting implications. Ethnographic women hunters in widely separated societies. Physiological evidence for female endurance. Strong female upper limbs and prehistoric skeletons. Cooperative childcare. Technologies that extend force through leverage and skill. What once looked like anomalies begin to reveal themselves as fragments of a suppressed norm. Paleolithic women did not merely support subsistence from the sidelines. Many of them entered directly into the most physically and symbolically charged forms of it. There is no need to overstate beyond the evidence. Not every woman hunted, not every man hunted. Human groups were varied, and age, pregnancy stage, illness, terrain, season, and local custom mattered. But the decisive point has already been won. The rigid, universal, naturalized male hunting monopoly is dead. The female body helped kill it, and the female burial finished the work. Older women listening now may know this flavor of correction all too well. How many times has a woman's ability been treated as an exception because the category itself was built to exclude her. How many times has female competence been acknowledged only as surprise? She could do it too. She turned out to be capable. She was stronger than expected. The prehistoric record begins to sound tired of that tone. It suggests instead that expectation itself was crooked from the beginning, and that the crookedness was never the woman's problem. It was always the description's problem. The chapter does not end, though, with triumph alone. It ends with a further question that runs into later history like a knife. If Paleolithic women were so central, so capable, so physically formidable, why do later societies remember them as weak? How did the species move from shared strain to stories of female dependence? What happened between the Ice Age woman whose toolkit marked her as hunter and the modern woman instructed to think of her body chiefly in terms of caution and delicacy? To answer that, we must follow the body into one of history's largest turns, the shift from mobile foraging worlds into agricultural ones, then onward into hierarchy, property, and the long social shrinking of female strength into duty without prestige. Because sometimes what civilization improves, it also conceals. Chapter 8. Agriculture did not invent female labour. It intensified, reorganised, and in many places enclosed it. This is one of the cruel pivots in the history of women's bodies. The move toward farming is often presented as the beginning of security, surplus, and settled life. For many women, it also meant repetitive toil of staggering scale, declining skeletal robustness relative to foragers, and over time, social arrangements that captured female work while lowering its status. The irony is almost severe enough to feel personal. The woman who may have hunted, tracked, carried, and moved within a relatively flexible foraging economy did not enter farming as a newly protected being. She entered it as labour. Fields needed constant attention. Grain needed planting, tending, harvesting, carrying, grinding. Animals needed water and care. Milk had to be processed. Meat had to be processed. Fibres had to be worked. Children remained children. The load did not narrow. It shifted and multiplied. The places she walked grew smaller, but the work she did in them grew denser. The Cambridge findings on prehistoric women's arm bones belong here with full force. Early agricultural women in Central Europe had upper limbs stronger than elite modern rowers. Bronze Age women retained extraordinary arm strength. Yet these women also existed after the broader decline in bone robustness that accompanied the move from foraging to farming. Put differently, even in a physically reduced post-foraging world, women were still working at a level that remodeled their skeletons into something many modern people would find astonishing. The reduction in human bone strength after agriculture is a story told mostly about male skeletons. Female skeletons, in many regions, kept punching well above what the new way of life required of men. That should change how we imagine the first villages, not as restful domestic enclaves where women passed into safety, but as engines of repeated female effort. Hours at the saddle quern alone may have loaded the arms powerfully. Grain ground for up to 5 hours each day in societies where this practice continued into recorded times. Add carrying water, carrying infants, carrying fuel, working dairy, preparing hides, weaving, tending animals, and manipulating heavy materials without machinery, and the upper arm findings become almost inevitable. The first villages were not soft places, they were heavy places, and women carried more than their share of the weight. Yet the social meaning of that effort changed. Archaeologists and historians have often noted that agriculture introduced resources that could be stored, defended, inherited, and monopolized. Fields, herds, houses, granaries, boundaries, and lineages altered power. Burial differentiation deepened in many later societies. Status could harden, gender hierarchy could harden with it. Women's contribution remained immense, but the symbolic order around it could narrow. The labour stayed, the recognition shrank, the two trajectories pulled apart, and the gap between them became one of history's most stubborn injustices. This is one reason the memory of female strength became so unstable. A society may rely deeply on women while praising them mainly for obedience, fertility, or modesty. It may consume their labour while denying the scale of it. It may build entire moral systems around female restraint at the same moment that female bodies are doing the heaviest part of the actual work. The contradiction does not announce itself. It hides behind ordinary words. A woman is called a good wife, a devoted mother, a faithful daughter, a hard-working woman, and the work itself disappears into the praise, as if praise had ever been a substitute for record. This pattern is older than written law, but written law eventually came along to formalize it. Where property could be inherited, who inherited became a political question. Where land could be owned, who owned became a political question. Where children carried lineage forward, control over female reproduction became a political question. The female body, once a working partner in survival, was increasingly described as a vessel needing supervision. The vocabulary of women shifted from capability to containment. The shift took thousands of years and travelled by many routes, but its direction was consistent. The female body was steadily redescribed as something to be governed rather than relied upon. Layer onto this the long arrival of organised religion in many regions, and the redescription became sacred. A woman's strength was no longer measured by what her arms had done by sundown. It was measured by her patience under direction, her silence under provocation, her endurance of conditions she had not chosen. There is real virtue in those qualities, and many women carried them with grace. But they are not the only female virtues, and the older virtues, the ones written into Paleolithic bone, were being slowly written out of cultural memory. The strong-armed woman of deep time receded into a folk type, half mythic, half laughable. The peasant woman with shoulders like a man, the working woman who had forgotten her place, the figure whose physical capability became a kind of social embarrassment in polite description. By the time industrial Europe began telling itself stories about the human past, the redescription was almost complete. The cave painting of the male hunter had become the headline. The female figure had become the background. Museums of the 19th and early 20th centuries arranged their dioramas to match. School textbooks followed. Films followed. A picture so consistent across so many media did not need to argue for itself. It simply became the air the modern imagination breathed. And in that air, the original strong woman of the Paleolithic could not be seen, because the air itself had been treated to keep her invisible. The cost of that invisibility has not been only historical, it has been physical. Generations of women have been told, sometimes gently and sometimes harshly, that their bodies are smaller, weaker, more fragile, less suited to demanding work, more in need of protection. Many women have lived inside those instructions and shaped their bodies accordingly. Movement was restricted, sports were discouraged, heavy work was either forbidden or, when permitted, was redescribed as sad necessity rather than as honourable capacity. The body, hearing these instructions year after year, often complied. The bone, indifferent to ideology but obedient to use, became what the instructions required. The result is one of the most painful contradictions of the modern female condition. Women have been told their bodies are naturally fragile, while simultaneously being expected to bear the bodily demands of pregnancy, child-rearing, household work, caregiving, and in many cases, paid labour. The fragility is asserted. The strength is silently used. The asserting and the using occur in the same culture, often in the same sentence, often by the same speaker. A woman is told she cannot lift this box, and 10 minutes later she lifts a child, a basket of laundry, a relative who has fallen, a bag of groceries, an elderly parent's arm. Her body keeps doing the work that her culture keeps insisting she is too delicate to do. There is a quiet grief in recognizing this pattern. Many older women listening tonight have lived inside that contradiction for decades. They have heard the language of female weakness while delivering the labor of female strength. They have been complimented for traits they did not particularly value, and have had their actual capabilities described as exceptions to their sex. They have grown old in bodies that did far more than their culture admitted, and have sometimes been told, late in life, that they should not have done so much. The same culture that took the labor now blames the woman for the wear. The Paleolithic woman would have recognized the contradiction immediately, even if she could not name it. She lived in a world that needed her labor and probably did not bother to deny it. The denial is a later invention. The denial is what civilization, in some of its turns, added to the bargain. It accepted the work, retained the work, demanded the work, and then, in its public stories, pretended the work had been done elsewhere, by other hands, in another room, by someone with a louder voice and a more dramatic outline. This is the loss that the bone refuses to allow. The bone keeps telling on the story. The bone in cemeteries from Central Europe to the high Andes, in burials from Sungir to Willamaya Pacheco, in the long catalogue of Upper Paleolithic skeletons, keeps insisting that female labour was vast, female participation was central. Female bodies were trained by use into a kind of strength that the modern world has nearly forgotten how to recognise. The recognition has been late, but late recognition is still recognition, and the recognition has begun to change the picture even outside the laboratory. The change matters because it reaches beyond history. It reaches into how women, especially older women, understand their own bodies right now. If your grandmother carried more than the language of her time admitted, then perhaps your mother did too. If your mother did, then perhaps you did. If you did, then perhaps the tiredness in your shoulders is not the tiredness of a fragile creature, but the honourable tiredness of a long-working body that has, like the Paleolithic woman before you, met its day. The tiredness is not failure. The tiredness is record. The tiredness is what a strong body looks like after the day is finished. So when the title says, Paleolithic women were stronger than modern men, it is not only making an archaeological point. It is opening a door for the listener to walk through. On the other side of that door is a different way of understanding the female body in history, and a different way of understanding the female body in the chair where you're sitting right now. The door does not close behind you. It stays open for the women who come next. Chapter 9. Inheritance is not only a matter of property, it is also a matter of body, memory, posture, gesture, instruction, expectation, and the long quiet transmission of what one generation of women teaches the next about what a female body is for. The bone in the Paleolithic cemetery is connected to the bone in your forearm tonight by a chain longer than language can fully trace. But the chain is real, and the chain has carried more than DNA. It has carried habit. Think of how a girl learns her body. She watches the women around her. She sees how they lift, how they bend, how they carry, how they rest, how they describe their own tiredness, how they speak about other women's bodies, how they handle pain, how they handle effort, how they handle praise, how they handle blame. Long before she is told anything explicit about what her body can or cannot do, she has already learned a great deal from observation. The observation becomes posture. The posture becomes habit. The habit becomes physiology. The physiology becomes eventually the woman she is at 60. For most of human history, the women a girl observed were women who worked hard. They lifted, carried, walked, stood for hours, bent over fires, scrubbed surfaces by hand, milked animals, cared for the sick, prepared the dead, raised the living. The girl who watched them saw a particular kind of female body in operation, a body that did not flinch from weight, a body that knew how to sustain rather than how to display, a body that wore its capacity as ordinary rather than exceptional. That inheritance shaped many female bodies for many generations. It was not always celebrated, but it was passed on. Something has changed in the last several generations, and it has changed faster than any prior change in the long history of female bodies. The shift from foraging to farming took thousands of years. The shift from farming to industrial life took centuries. The shift from industrial life to fully sedentary life in many parts of the developed world has taken roughly 2 human lifetimes. A girl born in the early 20th century in a rural household and a girl born in the early 21st century in a city apartment inhabit such different physical worlds that their bodies, by retirement age, may have less in common than either of them has with a Paleolithic ancestress in pure bone terms. That is a strange thing to admit, but the measurements suggest it. The decline is not the fault of the modern woman. She did not choose to inherit a world in which most labour is mediated by machines. She did not choose to be praised for stillness rather than for movement. She did not choose to receive, through advertising and culture, an image of the desirable female body that emphasizes thinness over capability. She inherited an environment, and her body has done what bodies always do. It has adapted to the environment it was given. The adaptation in this case has been downward. The bone has thinned. The internal mesh has loosened. The strength has receded. None of this is moral failing. All of it is mechanical reply. Yet the inheritance is not only downward. There is something else carried in the chain of female bodies that the modern world has not entirely been able to suppress. Watch an older woman lift a sleeping grandchild. Watch her ease that child from a car seat into a crib, supporting the head, balancing the weight, absorbing the small unconscious shifts of the dreaming body. The economy of motion is unmistakable. She is not displaying strength. She is using it. Watch the same woman lift a heavy pot from a low cupboard, or hoist a piece of furniture to clean behind it, or take an elderly partner's full weight as he transfers from bed to chair. The competence is not an act. It is a residue. It is what is left of an inheritance that the culture has tried to deny her access to, but has never quite managed to take entirely away. That residue matters because it is the bridge. It is the place where the Paleolithic woman and the modern listener actually touch one another, not in fantasy, in tendon, in hip. In the small, intelligent way an older woman knows how to stand up from a low chair without injuring herself, in the way she has learned to brace against a counter before lifting, in the way she rations her energy across a long day. These are not modern inventions. They are ancient practices, refined across countless generations of female bodies that had to keep working through tiredness, through pregnancy, through grief, through cold, through hunger, through the kind of days that did not end politely. There is a particular grace in older women's movement that younger women sometimes do not yet see, partly because younger women are still inside a different phase of the body. The older woman has been edited by use. She has lost some of her speed. She has lost some of her range. She has gained, in exchange, a precise knowledge of what her body can and cannot do, and she organizes her motions around that knowledge with an efficiency that is itself a form of strength. The Paleolithic record, in its way, honors that grace. It tells us that women who carried, ground, scraped, walked, climbed, and labored across long lives ended up with bodies whose internal architecture was profoundly organized by all of that effort. The bone was not random. The bone was a record of decisions repeated until they became structure. Transmission also moves in the other direction. Older women teach younger women, often without speaking. A mother shows a daughter by example how to hold a sleeping baby. A grandmother shows a granddaughter by example how to manage a small kitchen disaster without panic. An aunt shows a niece by example how to absorb bad news without falling apart in front of children who need her not to fall apart. These are not physical lessons in the gym sense, but they are bodily lessons in every sense that matters. They shape how the younger woman will inhabit her own body across the decades to come. They are part of the chain. In Paleolithic life, the chain would have been even more visible. A girl would have watched her mother, her aunts, her grandmother, and the older women of the band perform the daily disciplines of survival. She would have learned by proximity. She would have started small, with tasks that matched her growing strength, and would have moved through stages of competence until she was a full adult worker in her own right. The transition would not have been marked by a single ceremony in most cases. It would have been marked by the gradual extension of trust, the assigning of harder tasks, the inclusion in longer journeys, the participation in more dangerous work. By the time she reached full adulthood, her body would have been shaped not only by the work she had done, but by the watching she had done. The watching is itself a kind of training. That is one of the quietest reasons female bodies in deep time were so capable. They were trained by an entire community of older female bodies. They did not have to invent the body. They had to inhabit a body that had already been demonstrated to them in motion day after day by women who knew exactly what it would be asked to do. The transmission was constant. The transmission was bodily. The transmission was without slogans. We have lost much of that. In many modern households, the older women do not perform the daily disciplines of survival in front of younger women anymore, because those disciplines have been outsourced to machines and to markets. A girl in a contemporary city may rarely see an older woman lift heavy weight, carry significant distance, work resistant material, or labor through sustained physical effort. What she sees instead is older women managing the symbolic and emotional infrastructure of family life, which is real labor of a different kind, but it does not transmit physical capability in the same way. The bone, the muscle, the tendon do not receive the same instruction. The chain of physical inheritance has grown thinner. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a counsel of awareness. If you are listening tonight as an older woman, please understand how much you have already carried, often without being told that the carrying itself was a kind of teaching. The younger women in your life have learned from you in ways that neither of you may have named. Your steadiness, your endurance, your capacity to keep functioning through difficulty, your refusal to fall apart, your decades of bodily participation in family life. These have been instructions for them, written in motion rather than in words. They may not always thank you for it. The chain rarely thanks itself, but the chain holds, And if there is a way to return some of the lost physical inheritance to the women who come next, it does not require any of us to become Paleolithic. It requires only that we treat movement, strength, and bodily participation as part of what an older woman is allowed to be, rather than as something she is supposed to have outgrown. The bone responds to use at every age. It responds more slowly in later life, but it responds. The Paleolithic woman's lesson is not that we should all suddenly become hunters. It is that the female body, given honest demand across a life, becomes a quietly extraordinary instrument, and that this becoming is not the privilege of one ancient era. It is available in altered form to women in any era who refuse to treat their bodies as decorative objects, requiring protection from their own use. The chain that connects you to the women of deep time is not metaphorical. It is muscular, it is skeletal, it is hormonal, it is behavioral. It has been narrowed in recent generations, but it has not been broken. Every time an older woman lifts what she has been told she cannot lift, walks farther than she has been told she should walk, works harder than her diagnosis has been told to permit her, and keeps going through a day that other people would have surrendered to, she is reasserting that chain. She is, in a small and ordinary way, doing what the Paleolithic woman did. She is meeting the day with the body she has, and trusting that body to answer. The body, in most cases, answers. Chapter 10. The historical consequence of all of this reaches into the modern world in ways that are not merely intellectual. They are bodily. The story we have been telling about Paleolithic women and modern men changes how the listener understands her own life, her own physical history, her own present condition, and her own prospects in the years ahead. That is the point of history when it is done honestly. It is not a hobby of the past. It is a mirror held up to the present, sometimes a flattering mirror, more often a corrective one. Consider the modern female body as it has been shaped over the last 100 years in developed economies. The amount of habitual physical labour performed by an average woman has dropped sharply. Washing machines absorbed what had been hours of physical work. Refrigeration absorbed what had been daily food procurement and processing. Personal vehicles absorbed what had been walking. Heated homes absorbed what had been the body's own thermoregulatory work. Industrial food absorbed what had been preparation and preservation. Each of these was, in its own time, presented as liberation, and each of them did liberate something. But the liberation also came at a price, and the price was paid largely in bone, muscle, tendon, and metabolic capacity. The body that no longer has to do hard work begins to lose the capacity to do hard work, and the loss is so gradual that most of us do not notice it until something breaks. The breaking, when it comes, often arrives as a hip fracture, a wrist fracture, a vertebral compression, a fall on stairs, a small accident that an earlier body would have absorbed without damage. The older woman in modern life is often diagnosed with osteoporosis, prescribed medication, and instructed in fall prevention. All of this is reasonable medical practice given the bodies most modern older women actually inhabit. But it would have been almost unintelligible to a Paleolithic observer. The deep time woman did not, in most cases, live long enough to enter the osteoporosis age range. But the underlying tendency toward fragile bone in old age has been amplified by the modern reduction in habitual loading. The fragility is partly built. It is partly the long downstream consequence of a life that did not, day by day, demand enough of the bone to keep the bone substantial. Shaw's remark from earlier returns here with full weight. There is no anatomical reason a modern person could not achieve. Far stronger bone, the reason most do not, is not biology. It is environment. The environment has changed faster than the body has had time to redesign itself. The body, in evolutionary terms, is still calibrated for a Paleolithic level of demand. The world, in cultural terms, is calibrated for almost no physical demand at all. The mismatch lives in every modern skeleton, and in many cases lives most painfully in the skeletons of older women. Recognizing this is not a counsel of guilt. The listener tonight did not design the modern environment. She inherited it, lived inside it, and made the best of the body it gave her. But recognizing it does open a question that becomes more important as the listener moves through her later years. What can an older woman do, knowing what we now know, to honor the inheritance her Paleolithic ancestresses carried? The answer is not to attempt to become any of them. The answer is to refuse the lowest possible expectation of the modern female body, and to keep choosing, within whatever range her current condition allows, to use the body she has. Movement, in honest amounts, is part of that refusal. Carrying, in modest amounts, is part of that refusal. Standing up from a chair without help when help is not strictly necessary is part of that refusal. Walking up a set of stairs instead of using the elevator when the stairs are manageable is part of that refusal. Lifting groceries instead of having them delivered when delivery is not strictly necessary is part of that refusal. None of these acts will reproduce the Paleolithic body. None of them needs to. They will only signal to the bone, the muscle, and the tendon that the woman who lives inside them is still in business, and the body, in its quiet way, will answer accordingly. There is also a deeper consequence that runs through the whole story. The myth of male physical centrality, which the Paleolithic record has now substantially overturned, has had effects on women's psychology that are not easily measured but are easily felt. Many women, particularly those raised in earlier decades, were instructed to think of themselves as physically secondary to the men in their lives, to defer to male strength, to accept male description of female capability, to wait for male decisions about heavy lifting, to assume that male bodies were the natural reference point for what a body could and should do. None of this matched the Paleolithic reality. None of it matched the lived experience of most women, who knew perfectly well what they were lifting in their own kitchens. But the cultural pressure was strong, and many women carried it as a quiet shrinking of their own self-description. The new picture of Paleolithic women offers a permission those women may never have received in time. It says that female strength was not an aberration. It was the norm. It says that female participation in dangerous, skilled, demanding work was not an exception. It was widespread. It says that the modern image of female delicacy is a recent cultural product, not a natural inheritance. It says that the older woman who has worked hard all her life has been doing exactly what women have always done, in continuity with ancestresses going back tens of thousands of years. The continuity is the truth. The myth of separation is the recent invention. This permission arrives late for many. It does not arrive too late. Whatever years remain to the listener tonight, they can be lived with a slightly altered sense of who she has been and who she still is. Not a fragile creature who happened to do a lot. A strong woman who finally has language adequate to her own life. The bone in her forearm is the same bone that the Cambridge scientists scanned in the Neolithic women. The hip that has carried her through decades is the same hip that the Illinois foragers loaded with such density that their skeletons rivaled orangutans for internal architecture. The shoulder that has held grandchildren is the same shoulder that, in a deeper version of itself, scraped hides and ground grain and pulled at the world until the world answered. The body is the same body, only the demands have changed. The historical consequence of accepting the Paleolithic record is, in the end, a small but profound shift in how the modern woman understands herself. She is not a diminished version of the male body, lent some of his prestige in exchange for serving him. She is a long-line descendant of women whose bodies built the human world from raw material. She is, in measurable mechanical terms, descended from people who were stronger than most of the men who walk past her on the street today. The descent has been complicated. The descent has involved reduction. But the lineage is hers, and the lineage is not finished. The story closes one more circle here. The bones in the cemeteries that started this account did not testify in a courtroom. They testified in laboratories, on scanning tables, in publications that most of the world will never read. But the testimony has spread, in part because the testimony was just. Female labour, female endurance, female competence, female participation in every major form of Paleolithic survival, including the most dramatic ones, has finally been entered into the record. The record had been incomplete for a long time. The record is now closer to true. Closer is not perfect, but closer is enough to change the picture. And the picture, once changed, cannot be unchanged. That is the durable consequence of evidence. A myth can be repeated indefinitely as long as no one looks closely. The moment someone looks closely, the myth begins to lose its grip, and the grip rarely returns. Paleolithic women have been looked at closely. The grip of the old story has loosened. The female past has begun, at last, to come back into focus. What remains is for the listener to walk through the door this evidence has opened, and to carry what is on the other side back into her own life with whatever small dignities of movement, recognition, and self-description she is able to give herself in the years ahead. Consumption, the title that opened this evening, did not promise comfort. It promised a reversal. Paleolithic women were stronger than modern men, and the bones proved it. The bones are still proving it, in cemetery after cemetery, in scan after scan, in study after study. The proof is now beyond the point where any honest reader of the evidence can wave it away. The female past, for a long time described as the soft margin of human evolution, has turned out to be one of its load-bearing walls. You have walked tonight through a long argument made of many small pieces. Cambridge laboratories scanning the upper arms of Neolithic and Bronze Age women and finding strength that outmatched elite modern rowers. Illinois cemeteries holding ephemeral heads of hunter-gatherers, whose internal bone architecture stood comparison with orangutans, and farmers whose bones, by contrast, had thinned. The grave at Willamaya Patshaka in the high Andes, where a young woman lay 9,000 years deep beside the tools of a hunter, and the wider American record in which something close to 40% of identifiable big-game hunters in the relevant burials were likely female. The ethnographic record showing women hunting in 79% of foraging societies surveyed, and in 100% of those where hunting was the most important subsistence activity. The physiology that explains why this is possible: estrogen-driven fat metabolism, slow-twitch muscle fibers, recovery patterns favorable to endurance, body designs that ration energy across long effort. The technologies, like the atlatl, that further leveled the field, the trauma patterns shared between Neanderthal women and men, the bone needles, hide scrapers, and bone smoothers from sites scattered across Africa, Europe, and Asia, each one representing a patient handwork, often female, that made human expansion into cold places survivable. Behind each of these pieces stands a woman, not a category. A woman. She has a face we will never see, a name we will never know, a voice we will never hear. But she had all of them. She woke in a cold morning. She measured the day against the resources available. She moved through tasks that the modern world has nearly forgotten how to perform. She raised children whose own children eventually became us. She died, often young by modern standards, and her body settled into the ground without any expectation of being heard from again. The hearing came later, in a laboratory none of her contemporaries could have imagined. The hearing has finally arrived in full volume. It is worth holding that for a moment without rushing. Somewhere right now, in a museum drawer, in an archaeological storage facility, in a cardboard box catalogued by site number and date of recovery, lies the arm bone of a woman who lived 10,000 years before any of us were born. Her shoulder bore weight that would humble most living athletes. Her grip was practiced beyond the reach of modern training programs. Her bone, even in its present condition, is a denser, stronger, more architecturally substantial object than any equivalent bone in the average modern body, male or female. She is not a metaphor. She is a fact. She is currently approximately 20 inches long, lying in a drawer, waiting for nothing in particular, while across many oceans women are sitting in chairs, much like the one you are sitting in tonight, hearing the story she could not tell in her own voice. The argument of the evening has reached for honesty rather than flattery. It has not claimed that every Paleolithic woman could outwork every modern man in every contest. It has not claimed that ancient life was kind, or that women in deep time were spared suffering. They were not. Their lives were short, their losses were many, their bodies took damage. But within those lives, and partly because of those damages, the bone became a record of capability so substantial that the modern world, looking back, can no longer pretend the record says anything else. The record says, female bodies in deep time were trained by their lives into a level of strength most modern people would not recognize as female, and would not recognize as possible, until they saw the scans. If the title of this video did its work, you will not finish tonight with quite the same picture of the human past that you carried in this morning. You will carry, instead, a slightly heavier and more accurate picture. In that picture, women are not at the margin of human evolution. They are inside it. They are inside the hunting, inside the carrying, inside the making, inside the moving, inside the teaching, inside the burying, inside the surviving. They are inside the species itself, in proportions and intensities the old story refused to admit. The old story was wrong. The new story is not perfect, but it is closer, and closer matters. The picture also reaches forward, not only backward. If Paleolithic women were stronger than modern men, then the modern reduction of female bodies to images of fragility, decoration, or limitation is not an inheritance from nature. It is a recent cultural arrangement, sustained by habit, advertising, custom, and the long shrinking of female labour into work that does not build the same kind of body. The arrangement can be questioned. It is being questioned. Every older woman who refuses to accept the lowest expectation of her own body. Every younger woman who insists on physical participation in the actual world rather than only in its images. Every mother and grandmother who shows the next generation by example that female bodies are for use rather than only for display is, in a small way, reasserting the ancient norm. The bone, given even modest, honest demand, will respond. It always has. There is one final movement to make, and it belongs to you rather than to me. Somewhere in your life there are women, living or dead, who carried more than the language of their time admitted. A mother who raised children through conditions she did not choose. A grandmother who walked further, lifted more, and endured longer than anyone ever counted. A sister or aunt or friend whose capability was the quiet engine of a household that received the benefit and rarely the credit. A neighbour whose hands you remember as instruments of competence. A teacher whose stamina across decades shaped generations of children. A great-grandmother glimpsed only in a photograph, whose forearms tell you something even at that distance. Bring one of them, or several, into the room with you tonight, and let the picture of Paleolithic strength settle around them. They are part of the chain. They were not exceptions to the female body. They were participants in its long tradition of doing the work and being denied the language. The Paleolithic woman is their great-great-grandmother across countless generations, and they are her continuation in the ordinary kitchens, fields, factories, hospitals, classrooms, and households of the modern world. The lineage is not interrupted by the change in tools. The lineage is the female body itself, carrying life forward under load, century after century. I would like to ask one thing of you before this evening closes. If a woman has come to mind during the past hour whose strength you would like to name, even quietly, even to yourself, do that now. Name her. Place her somewhere in your memory where you will find her again. And, if you are willing, let other listeners know who she was. A first name, a relation, a single sentence about what her hands or her shoulders did over the years. The comments under this video will hold those names like a small modern cemetery of honest record. The kind of record that, until very recently, was not being kept for women at all. You can keep it now. We can keep it together. The bones in the laboratory drawers will continue their patient work. New studies will arrive. The picture will sharpen further, but the part of the story that needed to reach you tonight has already reached you. It is the part that says, the female body, in its deep tradition, has been strong, and the strength has been hidden in plain sight for far too long. The hiding is ending. The strength is being seen. The seeing changes what it means to be a woman growing older in a world that has, for so long, mistaken her endurance for her limitation. When you stand from the chair where you are sitting tonight, when your knees take your weight, when your back straightens, when your shoulders square against the gravity of another evening, remember that you are not standing on a fragile inheritance. You are standing on a long line of women whose bone outlasted the silence that tried to bury them. The silence has been broken. The line is yours. The body you carry is older than your name, older than your country, older than any of the descriptions that have ever been laid upon it. It is, in the most literal sense, prehistoric, and it has been waiting all this time for someone to tell it the truth. Tonight, the truth has been told. Carry it with you.